Hello and welcome to this video on embryo screening. This is a process whereby embryos, the ball of cells right at the beginning of life, are tested to see whether they have certain genetic disorders. We've discussed a couple of genetic disorders in this topic already, like polydactyly, when a sufferer can have more fingers or toes than they should have. And we've also talked about cystic fibrosis, a genetic disorder that affects cell membranes, which causes a build-up of mucus and causes a lot of problems for lungs and other organs. And the idea of embryo screening is that before an embryo goes on to develop into a baby and then a human being, can we test these embryos to see if they have the genetic disorders that we don't want to develop in a human? And can we then discard those embryos and choose an embryo that's not going to provide those genetic disorders? For example, when people are having fertility treatment to try and get pregnant, they use a process called IVF, where the sperm and the egg are fertilised under a microscope, and that's allowed to develop into an embryo, this initial ball of cells, which can then be put back into the woman's uterus. Now imagine a scenario then where IVF has produced a number of different embryos, and the idea of the screening then would be to take a cell from each of those embryos, which is a stem cell at this process, extract the DNA, which, if you remember, is held in the nucleus of the cells, have a look at the DNA in here and see if it contains the genes that would code for a particular genetic disorder. So see if it would code for things like cystic fibrosis or polydactyly. The idea would then be to discard those that would lead to a genetic disorder and find one that would be free of that particular genetic disorder that the parents will be a little bit more susceptible to, and then go on and implant that back into the woman. So obviously that would be great news for the parents, because if they were worried about having a child with a particular genetic disorder, if they went through the route of embryo screening, they would be able to select an embryo that would not have that genetic disorder. However, that does cause a few problems. It does have its advantages. It's a life-saving test, so socially it's really acceptable in that respect, because it will save lives, because some of these genetic disorders will cause either death at an early age or death before the baby even develops fully. And it can mean that some disorders are never passed on, so it can eradicate some disorders. If you knew that you could test for them and select an embryo that doesn't have those, you could get rid of that disorder altogether. However, there are ethical issues associated with embryo screening. So the idea that people think this could lead to designer babies. So not only would people start selecting for genetic disorders, but could this lead to people choosing the sex of their baby, or the colour of their baby's hair, or the colour of their baby's eyes? So getting onto the idea that they could actually design the baby and choose the baby that they'd want. Also, you are choosing whether to destroy or whether to keep an embryo. So you are selecting life, and some people think that even at this embryo stage here, when it's just a ball of cells, some people believe in this as the start of life, and if you're destroying embryos and getting rid of embryos, then therefore you are destroying life, and that you shouldn't do that. And this especially conflicts with some religious beliefs, okay, and the idea that you are destroying life or selecting life in some way. It does have positive economical benefits, however, which is all to do with money. If you ever see the word economical, think economy and money, because it will save money on treating disorders. If you can imagine, if someone grows up into a child, an adult with a particular genetic disorder, of course there will be money costs associated with helping that person live the best day-to-day life that they can. So by eradicating some of these disorders, that will also in the long run save money as well. So for your exam, you don't need to know the in-depth about the procedure that happens for embryo screening, but you do need to be aware of what it is and also be aware of some of the social, ethical and economical issues surrounding this procedure. If you found this video useful, then please press the like button below and subscribe for further videos. Thanks for watching.